The Atlantic doesn't just roar against the pylons of Hatteras Island. It gnaws at them like a starving dog on a sun-bleached bone. My name is Turner, and I've spent the better part of a decade listening to that hunger. Tonight, the air smells of necrotic brine and ozone, the kind of heavy, wet cold that settles in your marrow and refuses to leave. Inside the station, the only thing keeping the darkness at bay is the flickering, anemic glow of the CRT monitors. They cast a bruised violet light over Johnny's face as he hunches over the telemetry board, his eyes reflecting the jagged lines of a rising swell. We are the gatekeepers of the coast, watchers of the void, but tonight, the void is staring back through the data. Johnny tapped a nicotine-stained finger against the glass of Monitor 3. It wasn't a glitch, not exactly. Buoy 44006, anchored 12 miles out in the graveyard of the Atlantic, had stopped behaving like a machine. It was transmitting in a rhythmic, stuttering loop. Every 1.8 seconds, the screen refreshed with the exact same data points. Wind speed, 0. Wave height, 0. Surface temperature, -4 degrees Celsius. It was a digital flatline, a pulse of static-choked nothingness that defied the laws of the churning ocean outside. It felt less like a mechanical failure and more like a heartbeat, slow, heavy, and wrong. The silence in the room became a physical weight, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans and the wet slap of the tide against the lower pilings. I picked up the heavy, black handset of the secure line to the Marine Operations Center. The plastic felt cold, like a handle on a casket. Static hissed in my ear, a sound like dry husks of insects being crushed together. After 5 rings, the line clicked open, but there was no greeting. No professional warmth. Just the hollow, cavernous resonance of a long-distance connection to a place that didn't want to be found. "This is Turner at Hatteras Station Delta," I said, my voice sounding thin and alien in the cramped room. "We have got a lock loop on buoy 44006. It has been cycling the same null values for 20 minutes. Requesting a reset or a technician dispatch for the morning." There was a long pause. On the other end, I heard the sound of a pen scratching frantically against paper, then a low, wet wheeze. A woman's voice finally crawled through the receiver. It was a voice of grinding gears and frozen clockwork, devoid of any human inflection. "Log the anomaly as case 9-9 alpha, she whispered. The numbers felt like ice water down my spine. "Do not attempt to resync. Do not leave your station." I glanced at Johnny. He was watching me, his face pale in the monitor's blue rot. I started to ask about the protocol for case 9-9 alpha, but the dispatcher cut me off. Her tone shifted from bureaucratic coldness to a jagged, desperate urgency that made my skin crawl. "Listen to me, Turner," she hissed, the static on the line rising to a deafening roar. "Whatever you hear on the stairs, whatever you think you see on the tide, do not open the lower deck hatch tonight. Do not open it for any reason. Do not look for the light." The line went dead with a final, sickening pop, leaving me holding a handful of plastic and silence. The blue glow of the monitors seemed to dim, the shadows in the corners of the station stretching toward us like reaching fingers. Down below, deep in the guts of the station where the iron meets the sea, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic thud against the heavy steel of the lower deck hatch. Thump, 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 like something was trying to remember how to knock with hands that were no longer made of flesh and bone. The ocean was no longer outside. It was beginning to breathe through the floorboards. The air in the station had turned into something heavy and wet, a thick soup of ozone and ancient brine. Johnny stood by the ladder, his flashlight cutting a desperate, shaking path through the dark of the stairwell. He looked back at me, his face pale under the strobe of the red emergency lights. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The thudding against the hatch was loud enough to vibrate the marrow in my teeth. I lunged for the security console, my fingers slick with cold sweat as I toggled the feed for the exterior beach cameras. The floodlights were dead, killed by some invisible hand, but the infrared sensors still breathed. The screen flickered, a snowstorm of digital grain, and then the world resolved into a nightmare of sickly white and static grey. At first, I thought the tide had brought in a forest of driftwood. Dozens of long, pale shapes littered the sand, strewn about like the aftermath of a mass stranding. But then, the movement began. It wasn't the rhythmic sway of the tide. It was a synchronized, mechanical twitch. As if a single wire had been pulled across the entire beach, the figures began to rise. They didn't push themselves up with hands. They simply tilted, their spines snapping into place with a sickening fluidity. They were human in shape, but the geometry was all wrong. Their skin was the color of a drowned lung, stretched tight over frames that seemed too long, too thin. I punched the zoom, the camera whirring in protest. The image sharpened on one of them standing closest to the station. It was a man, or it had been. His jaw hung at an impossible angle, unhinged and slack, revealing a throat packed with wet sand and dark, pulsing polyps. Barnacles had rooted into his cheekbones, their calcified shells blooming like grey roses across his skin. His eyes were the worst part. They were milky orbs of pure cataracts, devoid of pupils, yet they were fixed directly on the camera lens. They weren't looking at the station. They were looking at me. Behind me, I heard Johnny's boots hitting the metal stairs. He was heading down to the hatch. I tried to scream, to tell him to stop, but my voice was a dry rasp in a throat tight with terror. I looked back at the screen, my eyes catching a glint of metal on the creature's chest. Hanging from a salt-corroded chain was a laminated card, a Noah contractor badge. The name was barely legible through the grime, Alvin Wallace. The dispatcher's voice echoed in my skull. "Don't open the lower deck hatch." I abandoned the console and sprinted toward the equipment closet in the back of the hub. My hands fumbled with the heavy brass override key, the metal freezing against my palm. I threw the door open, the hinges screaming. The smell hit me first, the suffocating stench of a tide pool left to rot in the sun. Inside, slumped behind the massive rack of backup batteries, was a man. He was wearing the same uniform I was, but he had been there a long time. This was the real Alvin Wallace. He hadn't been killed by the things outside. He had died in a tomb of his own making. His eardrums had ruptured, dried blood crusted in dark streaks down his neck. His hands were raw, the fingernails gone, worn down to the quick. In the dim red glow, I saw what he had been doing. He had scratched a single word into the steel housing of the battery rack over and over, hundreds of times, until the metal was scored deep and jagged. Open, open, open. Tucked into his stiff, cold fingers was a leather-bound logbook. I snatched it, the pages damp and swollen. I flipped through 11 months of madness. Alvin had seen them. He had studied them from the safety of the glass. He called them the Pale Watchers. He had discovered their secret, a frequency that shattered their nervous systems, a 360 Hz tone that resonated with the hollow cavities in their distorted bones. The station's Federal Signal Model 2 siren was tuned to that exact pitch. It was their only weakness. But the last page was a suicide note written in bureaucratic ink. Alvin had requested permission to activate the siren 18 times. Each request had been denied by the Marine Operations Center. Reason: unauthorized use of emergency signaling equipment. The final entry was a shaking scrawl. They are at the hatch. I cannot activate the siren without a signed work order 4B. If I break the rules, I lose my pension. I will wait for the dispatcher's call. He had waited until the air ran out. He had died a slave to the very system that had abandoned him to the sea. A thunderous crash shook the floorboards. The sound of shearing metal erupted from the lower deck. The hatch hadn't been opened. It had been torn from its hinges. I heard Johnny scream, a high, thin sound that was cut short by a wet, gurgling snap. I didn't think. I couldn't afford to. I grabbed a heavy pipe wrench from the tool bench and ran for the exterior catwalk door. The wind hit me like a physical blow, a freezing gale that smelled of ancient salt and dying things. The emergency lights didn't reach out here. There was only the roar of the Atlantic and the pale, shimmering shapes of the watchers moving toward the base of the tower. I looked up at the Model 2 siren, a massive iron throat silhouetted against the boiling clouds. I threw the power switch. Nothing. The motor was dead, seized by years of neglect and salt spray. I looked at the manual override crank on the side of the housing. It was a rusted iron handle that looked like it hadn't turned since the Cold War. I grabbed the handle and shoved. It didn't budge. Below me, I heard the rhythmic thud of feet on the stairs. They were coming up. I threw my entire weight against the crank, my boots slipping on the slick metal grating of the catwalk. It groaned, a piercing shriek of metal on metal, and then it turned an inch. The first of them reached the catwalk. It was Johnny, or the thing that had stolen his skin. His jaw swung like a broken gate, and his skin was already erupting with those jagged, grey barnacles. His movements were robotic, a series of staccato twitches that brought him closer with terrifying speed. He didn't look like my friend anymore. He looked like an empty vessel being piloted by the tide. I screamed and heaved the crank. The siren began to moan, a low, guttural vibration that I felt in my marrow. I spun the handle faster, my muscles screaming in protest. The moan climbed into a wail, and then a piercing, 360 Hz shriek that sliced through the roar of the storm. The effect was instantaneous. Below on the beach, the dozens of pale figures collapsed as if their hamstrings had been cut. They began to convulse, their limbs thrashing in the sand, their slack jaws snapping shut and open in a silent, agonizing rhythm. Johnny stopped 10 feet from me. He clutched his head, his fingers digging into his own temples, his body vibrating with such intensity that I could hear his bones clicking. I kept cranking. My left shoulder flared with a white-hot agony as the joint finally gave way under the strain. There was a sickening pop, a sound louder than the wind, as the humerus slid out of its socket. I didn't stop. I used my right hand. My teeth gritted until they cracked, forcing the siren to keep singing its lethal song. The catwalk grating beneath me began to sag, the bolts anchoring it to the tower snapping under the violent vibrations of the siren. I was hanging over the abyss, one arm useless, the other spinning a rusted handle that was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The watchers were retreating. They weren't running. They were crawling, dragging themselves back toward the surf in a desperate bid to escape the sound. Johnny was among them. He turned away from me, his movements no longer human, and began the long, mindless march into the freezing water. I watched the back of his head disappear beneath the black waves, followed by the others, until the beach was empty once more. I stayed on that catwalk until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, my hand frozen to the iron crank. My arm was a dead weight of purple flesh and shattered nerves. When the silence finally returned, it was heavier than the noise had been. I dragged myself back inside the station. The red emergency lights had finally died, replaced by the cold, indifferent grey of dawn. I sat at the broadcast desk, the logbook of a dead man sitting next to my microphone. I looked at the clock. 6 a.m. I reached out with my one good hand and flipped the switch for the morning weather report. My voice was calm, a hollow echo of the man I had been 8 hours ago. Hatteras Station reporting. Sky conditions, overcast. Visibility, 6 miles. Wind speed, 12 knots. 1 casualty reported. Everything is proceeding according to protocol. I looked at the closet where Alvin Wallace lay. He had followed every rule, and he was a corpse. I had broken every one of them, and I was still breathing. As I signed off, I realized the dispatcher wouldn't be calling. They never intended to. The station wasn't here to monitor the weather. It was here to monitor the tide. And the tide had finally gone out. The ocean isn't blue at 3 in the morning. It is the color of a fresh bruise, a deep and swelling purple that threatens to burst against the jagged shoreline of Hatteras Island. I sat in the glow of the monitors, the only light for miles, watching the green lines of the telemetry feed stutter like a dying pulse. Johnny was in the corner, nursing a lukewarm coffee that smelled more like burnt rubber than beans. We were the ghosts of the Atlantic, 2 men paid to watch the wind and wait for something that never happened. Then the boy started screaming. Not a sound, but a digital shriek. Boy 44014, sitting 12 miles out in the heavy dark, began transmitting a data loop that shouldn't have been possible. The wave height jumped from 3 feet to 80, then back to 0, over and over, a jagged heartbeat of impossible physics. It was a glitch, or the ocean was trying to tell us a lie. I picked up the receiver and dialed the Marine Operations Center. The line didn't ring. It just opened, like a mouth. The dispatcher didn't ask for my name. He gave me a case number, 9-9-9 Alpha, and then his voice turned into something cold and brittle, like frozen silk. He told me to stay away from the lower deck hatch. He told me that whatever I heard, whatever I thought I saw, I was not to break the seal. Then the line went dead, leaving nothing but the dry hiss of static in my ear. Johnny stood up, his eyes reflecting the flickering monitors. The exterior floodlights, those massive magnesium halos that kept the darkness at bay, flickered once and then died. The world outside the glass became an absolute void. I moved to the security console, my fingers trembling as I adjusted the gain on the infrared cameras. The beach wasn't empty. At first, I thought it was driftwood. Dozens of pale, narrow shapes littered the sand, half buried in the surf. Then they moved. They didn't stand up like men. They unfolded, their limbs snapping into place with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. There were dozens of them. Their skin was the color of a drowned lung, translucent and slick. As I zoomed in, the horror sharpened. They had no hair, no ears, just clusters of jagged, grey barnacles erupting from their cheeks and foreheads. Their eyes were milky spheres of cataracts and rot, and their jaws hung slack, disconnected from skull. They didn't look at the ocean. They looked at the station. They looked at us. Johnny went down to the lower deck before I could stop him. He said he heard a scratching, a sound like 1,000 tiny fingernails on the steel hatch. I stayed behind, my eyes glued to the monitor, watching the things on the beach rise in unison. I saw one of them crawl closer to the camera lens. Around its neck, tangled in a mess of seaweed and necrotic flesh, was a lanyard, a Noah contractor badge. I recognized the name through the grain of the night vision. Alvin Wallace. He was the man who had worked this station before us, the one who had disappeared during a nor'easter a year ago. I didn't think. I ran for the equipment closet, the override key heavy in my hand. I needed answers, or I needed a weapon. The closet door was reinforced steel, usually reserved for the high-voltage battery racks. It took 3 tries to get the key to turn, my hands slick with a cold sweat that felt like salt water. When the door swung open, the smell hit me first. It was the scent of a tide pool left to bake in the sun, a thick, cloying stench of rot, sulfur, and ancient salt. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, narrow, and harsh, a single finger of light in a tomb. I found him behind the primary battery rack. Alvin Wallace hadn't disappeared in a storm. He had died in a cage of his own making. He was slumped against the metal shelving, his body a desiccated husk, his skin stretched tight over bone like parchment. His eardrums had ruptured, leaving dried black trails of blood down his neck, staining his collar. But it was his hands that made me want to scream. His fingernails were gone, worn down to the raw, white bone. On the metal shelving above his head, he had scratched one word over and over again, hundreds of times, until the steel was scored white and the floor was littered with metal shavings and dried skin. Open, open, open. Beside his corpse lay a weathered logbook, its pages swollen with moisture and stained with the oils of his decaying hands. I flipped through it, my breath coming in shallow, ragged stabs that burned my lungs. It wasn't a weather log. It was a diary of a haunting. 11 months of research, of frequencies, of sightings, and of terrifying observations. Alvin had found them. He had watched them rise from the trench during the neap tides, and he had found their weakness. He had discovered that the Federal Signal Model 2 siren atop the station, when tuned to exactly 360 Hz, created a resonant frequency that acted like a physical blow to the creatures. It would cause their internal cavities to convulse, shattering the calcified barnacles on their skin and driving them back into the crushing depths. He had the data. He had the proof. He had the salvation of the station written in messy, frantic ink. But as I read the final entries, a different kind of horror set in, a horror of paper and ink, of protocol and silence. Alvin hadn't died because he couldn't save himself. He had died because he was waiting for permission. He had sent 42 reports to the regional office. He had begged for authorization to activate the siren outside of scheduled testing hours. Each time, the response was the same bureaucratic stonewall: stay the course, follow protocol, do not deviate from the manual without a signed 10 to 80 displacement form. The last entry was dated the night he died. He had watched them breach the hatch, he had watched them crawl up the stairs, and he sat there in the dark, clutching his radio, waiting for a green light that never came. He followed the rules until the rules killed him. He was a martyr for a bureaucracy that didn't even know his name. He died with a manual in his lap and a monster at his door. A wet, heavy thud echoed from the stairwell, followed by the sound of something liquid sliding over metal. I dropped the logbook and ran to the door. Johnny was standing at the bottom of the stairs. He wasn't Johnny anymore. His jaw hung at an impossible angle, swaying with every jerky movement of his head. Those grey, calcified barnacles were already blooming across his cheek, erupting through the skin in a spray of blood and seawater. He looked up at me, his eyes now that familiar, milky void of the things on the beach. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. He just began to climb, his fingers clicking against the metal railing like crab claws, his movements robotic and stiff. The hatch had failed. They were inside, and the infection was moving faster than the tide. I knew the siren's motor was shot. It hadn't been serviced in years, another victim of the budget cuts Alvin had complained about in his final, desperate pages. I grabbed a heavy iron wrench and charged for the exterior catwalk. The air outside was a freezing whip, lashing at my face with salt and ice. I reached the siren assembly, a rusted iron beast perched over the abyss. I grabbed the manual hand crank, a cold iron bar that felt like it was forged from the heart of a glacier. I began to turn. The first rotation was a groan of dying metal. The second was a scream. I poured every ounce of my terror, every bit of my hatred for the silent voices on the other end of the radio, into that crank. Below me, on the beach and around the base of the station, the pale figures froze. As the siren reached that piercing, 360 Hz wail, the world seemed to vibrate. My teeth ached. My vision blurred. My very marrow felt like it was boiling. The creatures began to convulse, their limbs jerking in a grotesque, synchronized dance. They fell to the sand, clutching their heads, their pale bodies heaving as the sound tore through their hollow frames. But the crank was heavy, and the gears were seizing, fighting me with decades of rust. I felt a hot, blinding flash of agony in my left shoulder. A sickening, wet pop echoed over the roar of the wind. My shoulder dislocated, the joint sliding out of its socket like wet soap. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I screamed into the gale, using my right hand to force the crank through another revolution, my left arm hanging limp and useless at my side like a broken wing. I was no longer a man. I was a machine of survival, fueled by the image of Alvin Wallace dying in the dark, waiting for a phone call that would never come. The tone blasted out over the Atlantic, a physical wall of sound that pushed back the night. The creatures turned, their movements no longer robotic but desperate and pained. They fled. They crawled back toward the surf, their bodies dragging through the wet sand as if the very air had become poison. Among them, I saw Johnny. He didn't fight it. He walked with a stiff, rhythmic gait into the freezing white foam of the breakers. He didn't look back at the light. He just kept walking until the black water rose over his head, swallowing the last of his humanity whole. The ocean took back what it had sent, and it took Johnny with it. The silence that followed was louder than the siren. I slumped against the cold iron of the catwalk, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my destroyed shoulder throbbing with a heartbeat of pure fire. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, a thin, sickly line of grey light that did nothing to warm the world. I dragged myself back inside, the empty station echoing with the hum of the cooling monitors and the smell of ozone. I sat at the desk, the logbook of the dead man still open on the floor, its pages fluttering in the draft. I reached out with my one good arm and keyed the radio. It was 6 a.m. Time for the mandatory broadcast. I cleared my throat, the salt crusting on my lips, my voice a hollow rasp. I gave the wind speed. I gave the barometric pressure. I gave the visibility. My voice was calm, a steady, bureaucratic drone in the empty room. I realized then that the dispatcher wouldn't be calling to check on us. They never intended to. The station wasn't here to monitor the weather. It wasn't here to help the ships at sea or provide data for the evening news. It was here to monitor the tide, to watch the things that rose when the moon was right and the world was looking the other way. Alvin Wallace had followed every rule, and he was a corpse in a closet, a footnote in a filing cabinet. I had broken every one of them. I had destroyed my body and ignored my orders, and I was still breathing. As I signed off, I realized the dispatcher wouldn't be calling. They never intended to. The station wasn't here to monitor the weather. It was here to monitor the tide. And the tide had finally gone out. I sat there in the growing light, watching the empty beach. The waves were calm now, rhythmic and indifferent, washing away the footprints of the things that had been there. I looked at the lanyard on the floor, the one I had taken from the thing that used to be Alvin. I didn't feel relief. I felt a cold, hard clarity that was sharper than any blade. The rules were just a way to make the end orderly. They were the script for a play that only ended in a burial. I reached for the logbook and began to write, not a report for the office, but a warning for whoever came next. I wouldn't wait for permission. I wouldn't wait for the green light. I would be the one to tell the next man what lives in the deep and what happens when the floodlights fail. Because out here on the edge of the world, the only thing more dangerous than the monsters in the water is the silence from the shore. The static on the radio hissed, a mocking, hollow laughter that filled the room. I leaned back, my one good hand resting on the siren control. The ocean was quiet for now, but I knew the truth. It was just catching its breath. And when it returned, I wouldn't be checking the manual. I would be ready to make it scream. The radio hissed, a mocking, hollow laughter that filled the room. I leaned back, my one good hand resting on the siren control. The ocean was quiet for now, but I knew the truth. It was just catching its breath. And when it returned, I wouldn't be checking the manual. I would be ready to make it scream. The night had started with a glitch. Station 44 on Hatteras Island is a place of salt-crusted silence and the rhythmic, clinical hum of computers. But tonight, the ocean was talking back in a language we weren't meant to translate. Johnny and I were staring at the monitors when the data from Buoy 12 started looping. It wasn't just a sensor error. It was a rhythmic, mathematical pulse, a stutter in the dark that felt less like a mechanical failure and more like a heartbeat. I picked up the heavy receiver and dialed the Marine Operations Center. The line didn't ring, it just opened. The dispatcher's voice was a dry, paper-thin rasp, devoid of the usual bureaucratic boredom. I gave him the coordinates, the buoy ID, and the strange frequency of the loop. There was a long, agonizing pause where the only sound was the static of the Atlantic. Then, he spoke. Case number 7-9-9-4, he said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. Turner, listen to me very carefully. Do not check the buoy. Do not leave the station. And for the love of God, whatever you do not open the lower deck hatch tonight. The line went dead before I could ask why. I looked at Johnny. His face was a pale mask under the cold, clinical office lights. Before he could speak, the exterior floodlights, the massive, industrial beams that carved a sanctuary out of the coastal blackness, simply vanished. They didn't flicker. They were extinguished. Johnny grabbed a heavy mag light, his instincts overriding the dispatcher's warning. He headed for the stairs to the lower deck, mumbling about a tripped breaker. I stayed in the chair, my eyes glued to the security feed. I switched the cameras to infrared, and my stomach turned into a block of ice. The beach wasn't empty. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, were lying flat on the sand, perfectly still. They looked like driftwood at first, or bloated seals. Then, as if a single wire had been pulled across the entire shoreline, they rose. They were pale, human-like shapes, but their skin had the texture of wet parchment stretched over jagged bone. Their faces were a nightmare of biology. Barnacles were encrusted into their cheeks and foreheads, forming calcified crowns of filth. Their eyes were milky orbs of pure void, reflecting nothing. Their jaws hung slack, unhinged, swaying with the wind. They weren't looking at the ocean. They were all staring directly up at the station's windows. I screamed for Johnny to get back, but the intercom just crackled with that same hollow laughter from the radio. I zoomed the camera in on one of the figures standing nearest the hatch. Around its neck, tangled in a mess of kelp and rotting fabric, was a NOAA contractor badge. I knew that name. Alvin Wallace. Panic is a cold fire. I ran to the equipment closet, bypassing the locked panels with the emergency override key. The air in the back of the station smelled of ozone and something sweet, like rotting lilies. I shoved aside a heavy battery rack and found him. Alvin wasn't one of the things outside. He was here. He had been here for months. He was curled in a fetal position behind the lead-acid batteries, his body a desiccated husk. His eardrums had ruptured, dried blood staining the sides of his neck like dark wine. He had used his last moments to communicate, but not with a radio. He had scratched a single word into the metal shelving over and over again until his fingernails were gone and he was carving with the bone of his fingertips. Open, open, open. Beside his hand lay a leather-bound logbook. I snatched it up, my hand shaking so hard the pages rattled. It was 11 months of madness recorded in meticulous, scientific detail. Alvin had been studying them. He called them the resonators. He knew they were coming. He had found their weakness, a specific acoustic vulnerability. A 360 Hz tone, delivered at high decibels, caused their cellular structure to destabilize. It turned their very nervous systems into a cage of agony. The station's Federal Signal Model 2 siren was capable of hitting that exact pitch. But as I read the final entries, a sick realization washed over me. Alvin hadn't died because he couldn't stop them. He died because he was waiting for permission. Page after page detail his ignored reports, his requests for siren authorization, and the cold, bureaucratic denials from superiors who cited noise ordinances and protocol. He had the weapon in his hand, and he let himself rot because the manual didn't have a chapter on the end of the world. A heavy thud shook the floorboards. Then another. I looked at the monitor. The lower deck hatch, the one the dispatcher told me to keep shut, was buckling. Johnny was there, but he wasn't Johnny anymore. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs, his movements robotic and jerky, like a marionette being pulled by rusted wire. His jaw was hanging at an impossible angle, and as I watched, a cluster of barnacles erupted through the skin of his throat, blooming like a grey, stony cancer. He started to climb. I didn't have time for a radio call. I didn't have time for a case number. I ran for the door that led to the exterior catwalk. The wind hit me like a physical blow, a freezing, salt-heavy wall that tried to push me back into the station. The catwalk grating was slick with ice and sea spray. I reached the siren housing, my fingers fumbling with the frozen latches. I hit the activation switch. Nothing. The motor gave a pathetic, grinding whine and died. The salt air had eaten the gears. The things were already on the stairs. I could hear the wet, dragging sound of their feet on the metal. I grabbed the manual hand crank. It was a heavy iron bar designed for maintenance, never intended to be used as a primary trigger. I threw my weight against it. The metal was so cold it tore the skin from my palms. I pushed. The siren groaned. I pushed again, finding a rhythm, my muscles screaming as I forced the ancient gears to turn. I needed 360 hertz. I needed the frequency of heaven to drive back the hell on the beach. The first blast of sound tore through the night. It wasn't a roar, it was a shriek that vibrated in my very teeth. Below me, the swarm stopped. They didn't just flinch, they convulsed. Their bodies jerked in violent, bone-snapping spasms. I kept cranking. I poured every ounce of my terror and my rage into that iron handle. The catwalk beneath me began to groan, the bolts shearing off as the vibrations reached a crescendo. Then, I heard a sound louder than the siren, a wet, sickening pop. My left shoulder gave way. The joint dislocated, the humerus tearing through the labrum with the sound of wet canvas ripping. White-hot agony blinded me, a galaxy of pain exploding in my vision. I slumped against the housing, my left arm hanging uselessly like a dead weight. But the creatures were still there. Johnny was at the top of the stairs, his milk-white eyes fixed on mine. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached across my body with my right hand, grabbed the crank, and used my entire body weight to pull. I used the pain to drive the motion. Each rotation was a masterpiece of suffering, but the tone held. 360 hertz. A wall of invisible force. The things on the beach began to retreat. They didn't run. They collapsed back into the surf, their bodies vibrating so intensely they looked like blurred static against the dark water. Johnny stood at the railing for a moment, his head twitching. For a second, just one, I thought I saw a glimmer of the man I knew. Then, he stepped over the edge. He didn't fall. He marched. He joined the horde, a mindless soldier in a rotting army, walking into the freezing Atlantic until the black waves swallowed his head. I kept cranking until the sun began to bleed a dull, bruised purple over the horizon. I dragged myself back inside the station, my left arm a ruined, swollen mess pinned to my chest. The silence was deafening. The clinical office lights were still humming, indifferent to the slaughter. I sat down at the console, the leather of the chair feeling strangely alien against my skin. I looked at the clock. 6 a.m. With my one good hand, I reached for the microphone. My fingers were stained with blood and grease, and my breath hitched in my chest, but I kept my voice flat. Professional. Bureaucratic. This is Weather Station 44, I said into the void. Coastal report for October 12th, wind speeds at 12 knots. Visibility 10 miles. Seas at 3 to 5 feet. All systems operational. I looked at Alvin's logbook, then at the manual on the desk. Alvin died a good employee, a man who followed every rule until they buried him. I was a broken man in a broken station, but I was breathing. The ocean was quiet for now, but I knew the truth. It was just catching its breath. And when it returned, I wouldn't be checking the manual. I would be ready to make it scream. The salt air didn't smell like the ocean anymore. It smelled like wet lime and the rot of a 1,000-year-old tomb. The station was groaning, a steel carcass being picked apart by the Atlantic, and down below, the lower deck hatch was finally giving way. I could hear the wet, rhythmic slapping of feet against metal, a sound like raw meat being thrown against a butcher's block. Johnny was down there. Or what was left of Johnny. The man I'd shared coffee with 2 hours ago was now a vessel for something pale and calcified, a puppet of the tide. I didn't have a weapon. I had a dead man's notebook and a realization that burned hotter than the adrenaline dumping into my blood. Alvin Wallace had died for a protocol that didn't love him back. He had the answer in his hands, 360 hertz, but he waited for a signature that never came. I wasn't going to wait. I kicked open the door to the exterior catwalk and the storm hit me like a physical blow. The floodlights were dead, leaving the world in a jagged, strobe light reality. Every few seconds, a flash of lightning would tear the sky open, revealing the nightmare on the sand. There were hundreds of them now. They weren't just standing anymore. They were moving in a slow, synchronized undulation, their milky eyes fixed on the station like stars drawn to a dying sun. The sea spray was freezing, coating the metal grating in a slick glaze of ice and brine. I lunged for the housing of the Federal Signal Model 2. It sat on the edge of the catwalk like a rusted iron beast. I hit the internal starter, but all I got was the pathetic, dying click of a seized motor. The salt had eaten the gears. The bureaucracy had let it rot. I looked down and saw the first of them. A pale, hairless head breached the railing of the lower deck. Then another. They didn't scream. They didn't growl. They just breathed in a wet, rhythmic wheeze that sounded like the tide pulling back over gravel. I found the emergency manual crank tucked into the side of the siren's base. It was a heavy iron bar, pitted with rust. I slotted it into the drive shaft and began to turn. The first rotation felt like I was trying to grind stones together. My muscles screamed as I forced the heavy internal rotor to spin against decades of neglect. I heard the first low moan of the siren, a pathetic, wavering sound that was instantly swallowed by the gale. I threw my entire weight into the next turn. And the next. Flash. Lightning illuminated the stairs. They were halfway up. Their faces were a mosaic of jagged barnacles and weeping sores, their jaws hanging slack as if the hinges had been melted away. I saw the NOAA badge around one of their necks, the contractor who had disappeared last July. He was part of the reef now. I leaned into the crank, my boots slipping on the wet grating. The siren began to climb in pitch. It wasn't a roar, it was a shriek, a piercing, artificial wail that sliced through the roar of the wind. I watched the creatures on the beach. As the tone hit that sweet, resonant frequency of 360 Hz, the effect was instantaneous. The things on the stairs stopped. Their heads snapped back at an impossible angle, their bodies beginning to vibrate with a violent, high-frequency tremor. It looked like they were being electrocuted by the air itself. On the beach, the swarm collapsed into the surf, their limbs thrashing as the sound waves tore through their alien biology. But the siren was fighting me. The internal friction was generating a heat I could feel through my gloves, and the resistance was doubling. I needed more speed. I needed to keep the pitch steady. I gripped the handle with both hands, my teeth grinding until I thought they'd shatter. Then came the snap. It wasn't the machine. It was me. My left shoulder gave way under the sheer torque, the humerus popping out of the socket with a sickening, wet thud that I felt in my marrow. The world went white for a second, the pain a jagged bolt of lightning behind my eyes. I slumped against the siren, the crank spinning backward, the pitch dropping into a useless, low growl. The creatures stopped shaking. They began to rise. I looked down at my dangling left arm, a useless piece of meat hanging by my side. The pain was a roar, a void that threatened to swallow my consciousness. I looked at the stairs. Johnny was there. He was at the top of the landing. His face was almost entirely obscured by a crust of white shells, but his eyes were still human enough to convey a hollow, terrifying vacancy. He took a step toward me, his movements mechanical, his fingers twitching in the rhythm of the tide. I didn't have a choice. I reached across my body with my right hand, grabbing the iron crank. I planted my feet, ignored the fire screaming in my shoulder, and began to turn again. I screamed. I roared into the wind, a sound of pure, unadulterated defiance that matched the rising wail of the siren. I turned the crank with the strength of a man who had already accepted he was dead. The 360 Hz tone returned, louder this time, a physical wall of sound that vibrated the very marrow of my bones. The creatures on the catwalk exploded in a spray of grey fluid and pulverized shell. Johnny, the thing that used to be Johnny, recoiled, his hands clawing at his ears as his eardrums ruptured. He didn't fall. He turned. He and the entire swarm began to retreat, driven back by the sonic pressure. I didn't stop. I kept cranking even as my vision blurred and the taste of copper filled my mouth. I watched them through the strobe of the storm. They were marching back into the Atlantic, a funeral procession of the damned. They didn't run. They simply walked into the freezing black surf, their heads disappearing beneath the whitecaps until there was nothing left but the churning void of the ocean. Johnny was the last to go. He walked until the water was at his chin, then he let the current take him. He didn't look back. The sun didn't rise so much as the darkness simply turned to a dull, bruised grey. The siren finally ceased for good, the internal gears welding themselves together from the heat. I let go of the crank and fell to the grating, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. My left arm was a swollen, purple ruin. The catwalk was covered in a layer of fine, grey dust, the pulverized remains of the barnacles that had tried to claim the station. I dragged myself upright, using the railing for support. The pain in my shoulder had settled into a dull, throbbing hum that felt like static. I crawled back inside the station, the silence of the interior feeling heavier than the roar of the storm ever had. The equipment was still humming. The monitors were still flickering with the cold, indifferent data of the weather. I looked at the clock. 5:58. I slumped into the operator's chair, the vinyl cold against my skin. I reached out with my right hand and flipped the toggle for the morning broadcast. My fingers were stained with grease and blood, leaving dark smears on the ivory switches. "This is Hatteras Station," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The words were dry, mechanical. I gave the barometric pressure. I gave the wind speed. I gave the wave heights. I gave them every piece of data the manual required. I looked at the empty seat where Johnny should have been. I looked at the closed door of the equipment closet where Alvin Wallace lay cold behind the batteries. Alvin had followed every rule, and he was a corpse. I had broken every protocol, and I was a wreck. But I was a wreck that was still breathing. I finished the report and signed off. The sun was finally hitting the water, turning the Atlantic into a sheet of hammered silver. It looked beautiful. It looked peaceful. But I knew what was down there. I knew the ocean wasn't finished. It was just reset, waiting for the next shift, waiting for the next man who believed the rules would save him. I leaned back and watched the horizon. My arm was destroyed. My friend was gone. The station was a tomb. But as the light filled the room, I realized I wasn't checking the manual anymore. I reached into my pocket, pulled out Alvin's notebook, and tossed it into the trash can. From now on, I wouldn't be following the weather. I'd be waiting for it. And next time, I wouldn't need a signature to make the world scream back. The silence that followed the siren wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum, the kind of quiet that rings in your ears until you start to hear the ghost of the sound that preceded it. I stood on that frozen catwalk, my left arm a dead weight of screaming nerves and ruined meat. My shoulder wasn't just dislocated. It felt like the socket had been hollowed out with a rusty spoon. The cold Atlantic wind bit into the exposed marrow of my exhaustion, salt spray stinging the fresh tears in my skin. Below, the beach was empty. No pale figures. No barnacle-crusted faces. Just the rhythmic, indifferent pulse of the tide reclaiming the shore, washing away the footprints of things that should never have walked on land. I let go of the manual crank. It spun backward with a pathetic, mechanical rattle, a dying gasp of the machine that had just saved my life. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a carcass that had forgotten to stop breathing. The sky was beginning to turn, but there was no gold in this sunrise. It was a sickly, anemic grey, the colour of a drowned man's skin. The light didn't illuminate the world. It just made the shadows look thinner, more translucent, like a veil pulled tight over a rotting face. I dragged myself back through the hatch, my boots heavy with sea salt and the phantom weight of Johnny's disappearance. The station interior felt different now. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a tomb with better lighting. The humming of the servers sounded like a low-frequency dirge, a mechanical mourning for the men who had been consumed by the silence of the sea. I bypassed the equipment closet. I couldn't look at Alvin Wallace again. I couldn't look at the way he'd scratched the metal until his fingers were bone. He'd died for the rules. He'd died waiting for a signature from a man in a climate-controlled office 300 miles away who didn't believe in monsters. I reached the main console and collapsed into the swivel chair. The leather groaned under me, a sound so human it made me flinch. My left arm hung uselessly, a purple-black swelling already beginning to puff out the sleeve of my jacket. I didn't reach for the first aid kit. I didn't reach for the phone to call the Marine Operations Center. I knew what they would say. They'd ask for a case number. They'd ask if I'd followed Section 4, Paragraph B of the Emergency Frequency Protocol. They'd ask for a signature I couldn't give. The clock on the wall ticked with a jagged, rhythmic precision. 5:52 a.m. 8 minutes until the mandatory broadcast. 8 minutes until I had to tell the world that the wind was blowing at 12 knots and the humidity was holding steady at 84%. The absurdity of it tasted like copper in my mouth. Johnny was out there, his lungs filling with salt water, his mind replaced by whatever hive will commanded those things, and I was supposed to report on the barometric pressure. I looked at the monitors. The ocean buoys were back to normal. The data loops had snapped, replaced by the steady, boring feed of a sleeping ocean. It was as if the world had hit a reset, but in the moment the siren stopped. The bureaucracy of nature had resumed its schedule, and it expected me to do the same. I reached out with my right hand, my fingers trembling as I gripped the edge of the desk. I pulled the logbook toward me, the official one, not Alvin's secret manifesto of madness. I flipped to the page for today's date. The paper felt like sandpaper against my skin. I began to write. Not about the creatures. Not about the siren. Not about the man who turned into a reef before my very eyes. I wrote the numbers. Temperature, 42 degrees. Visibility, 3 miles. Sea state, moderate. Every stroke of the pen felt like a betrayal. I was participating in the lie. I was smoothing over the jagged edges of the void, making the world safe for the people who would wake up to their coffee and their morning news, never knowing that the only thing standing between them and the dark was a broken man with a hand crank. I looked at the trash can where I'd thrown Alvin's notebook. It sat there, a crumpled testament to a truth that was too heavy for the official record. Alvin had tried to be a good soldier. He tried to follow the map, and the map had led him into a corner where he couldn't breathe. I realized then that the authorization he'd been waiting for wasn't coming. It was never coming. The system wasn't designed to save us. It was designed to catalog our remains. The clock hit 5:59 a.m. I adjusted the headset, the plastic cold against my temple. I flipped the toggle on the transmitter. The static hissed in my ears, a jagged, white noise ocean that sounded like the voices of the things on the beach. For a second, I thought I heard Johnny's voice in the interference, a wet, clicking sound that tried to form words but only found salt. I shut my eyes tight, forcing the image of his slack jaw out of my mind. The red light on the console flickered to life. Live. I cleared my throat. The sound was a dry, rasping thing, like dead leaves on a sidewalk. "This is Hatteras Coastal Weather Station Alpha 7, I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. It was hollow, stripped of everything but the necessary data. 6 a.m. mandatory report for Tuesday, November 14th. I looked out the window. The grey light had settled over the Atlantic, turning the water into a sheet of hammered lead. There was no sign of the swarm, no sign of the struggle, just the endless, rolling void. Barometric pressure is 29.92 inches and falling, I continued, my gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky and the sea blurred into a single, indistinguishable line of nothingness. Wind is out of the northeast at 15 knots. Gusts up to 22. Small craft advisory remains in effect. I paused, my breath hitching in my chest. My shoulder throbbed in time with the station's heartbeat. I wanted to scream into the microphone. I wanted to tell them that the sea was hungry. I wanted to tell them that we are all just meat waiting for the tide to turn. I wanted to tell them that Alvin Wallace was dead because he was a good man, and Johnny was gone because he was my friend. Instead, I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. I thought about the dispatcher's warning. Don't open the lower deck hatch tonight. They knew. They'd always known. The bureaucracy wasn't ignorant. It was complicit. It was a cold, calculated silence that traded lives for the maintenance of the status quo. Visibility is currently limited due to morning mist, I said, my voice steadying, turning into the very thing I hated, a calm, professional mask. Expect clearing by mid-morning. Sea temperature is 46 degrees. I looked at the empty chair across from me where Johnny used to sit and crack jokes about the shitty coffee. The room felt cavernous, an architectural hollow point aimed at my heart. I realized then that I wasn't just reporting the weather. I was reporting the survival of the void. I was the witness who had been silenced by the very act of speaking. End of report, I whispered. This is Turner, signing off. I flipped the switch. The red light died. The static returned, a comforting roar that drowned out the sound of my own ragged breathing. I sat there for a long time, the grey morning light spilling across the floor like spilled milk. My arm was a wreck, my friend was a monster, and my predecessor was a corpse in the closet. But as I looked at the official logbook, sitting there on the desk with its neat rows of numbers and its sterile observations, I felt a strange, cold clarity. Alvin's blind obedience had been his shroud. He'd waited for permission to survive, and the world had let him die. I had broken the machine to save myself. I had reached into the guts of the protocol and ripped out the parts that didn't work. I had made the world scream back, and for a few minutes, the monsters had been the ones who were afraid. I reached into my pocket with my good hand and pulled out a cigarette. My hands were shaking, but I managed to light it. The smoke tasted like charcoal and ash, a sharp contrast to the salt-thick air of the station. I exhaled, watching the grey cloud drift up toward the fluorescent lights, swirling in the draft from the broken hatch below. The sun was higher now, a pale, sickly disk struggling to pierce through the coastal gloom. It didn't bring warmth. It just revealed the scale of the isolation. I was alone in a tower of glass and steel, surrounded by an ocean that had tried to swallow me whole. I looked at the trash can one last time. Alvin's notebook was gone from my sight, but the 360 Hz tone was still ringing in my bones. I knew now that the weather wasn't just the wind and the rain. It was the thing that lived beneath them. It was the pressure of the unknown, the cold front of the impossible, and the high tide of a hunger that had been waiting since the world was young. I leaned back in the chair, ignoring the agony in my shoulder. I watched the waves roll in, one after another, a tireless, mechanical procession of grey and white. From now on, I wouldn't be following the weather. I'd be waiting for it. I'd be listening for the loop in the data, the stutter in the static, the sound of the hatch clicking open in the dark. And next time, I wouldn't need a signature to make the world scream back. I would be the storm. I closed my eyes and let the pale morning light wash over me, a bitter, melancholy baptism. The shift wasn't over. It was never really over. Out here, on the edge of the map, the sun only rises so you can see what's coming for you next. I stayed in the chair, a solitary ghost in a station of glass, watching the grey Atlantic churn, waiting for the numbers to change, and listening for the sound of barnacles scraping against the door.